want to introduce Peter Gleick to you. Peter is more than our afternoon keynote speaker. Peter, starting yesterday and through today and tomorrow, is our resident scholar for water for these 3 days as part of our Dyson College Institute for Sustainability and Environment program. And Peter led some splendid workshops with students and faculty yesterday, both about the future of water, global water issues, and the future of universities and the future of water. And we're very grateful for him to put in all this effort for us. Peter's a world-renowned expert, innovator, and communicator on water and climate issues. In 1987, he co-founded the Pacific Institute, which he led as president until mid-2016, when he became President Emeritus and Chief Scientist. Gleick received the prestigious MacArthur Genius Fellowship and was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and recipient of the Vente Chow Award from the International Water Resources Association and the United States Water Prize from the U.S. Water Alliance. Join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Gleick.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Here I am in the after-lunch death period. I keep promising myself I'll never agree to talk after lunch, and then here I am again. First of all, thank you to Pace University and to John Cronin and to Dean Herman for inviting me. This has been a very exciting morning, and yesterday was really interesting. I've had a great time learning about what Pace has been doing. And I love being in New York. I was born and raised in New York. I come here, the first thing I do is I have some tap water. You know, that thing about how great New York tap water is, it's true. It's just, I love it. So I'm happy to be here for that reason as well. What I'm going to do this afternoon is talk a little bit in the biggest sense, I'll give you a little bit of a global overview of water issues to provide a little bit of context for some of what you heard this morning and some of what you're going to hear for the rest of the day about some of our challenges, some of the solutions that I think are coming for water. And I'll close with a few thoughts about U.S. water policy as maybe a lead-in to prime the pump, so to speak, about the panel discussion that's going to follow. So water is on everybody's mind, not just yours. We hear about water stories in the news every day, about droughts, about floods, about shortages, about conflict, contamination events here or there, the rollback of federal protections and the political debates that we've increasingly been having and I'm afraid are going to have for some time to come. And there's plenty of bad news about water. I'm going to talk about some of that bad news. But I also believe that we are in a transition. We, the globe, are in a transition from where we are today with all of the bad news and where I think ultimately we're going to end up, which I believe is sustainable management and use of our fresh water resources. I'm an optimist. I think that is inevitable. The challenge is how do we get from here to there, and how bad do things have to get, and who's going to suffer? And those are the difficult things that we're going to have to deal with. But I think we're in a transition in the right direction, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. What I want to do is I want to talk about what I call the 3 ages of water, some of the new challenges that we face today that are a little different than the way we thought about water in the 20th century, some solutions. But I'm also going to talk about Mesopotamia and the ancient Romans and 19th century poetry and cholera and the Great Lakes and climate change and dead fish and Mars and the moons of Saturn and the California drought, and this year is the California wettest year on record following the California drought, and Benjamin Disraeli and Nelson Mandela, all of which, as you know, are related to water. Really? Okay, so let me talk about the 3 ages of water. The first age could be thought of as when Homo sapiens evolved and moved out of Africa and started to spread across the globe, when water was simply what you found. We took water out of rivers and lakes or wherever we found it, and we dumped our wastes wherever we were, and it didn't matter. There weren't many humans, and life was pretty brutish and miserable anyway. And that age lasted for 100,000 years or so after the evolution of Homo sapiens. And it led up to what I call the second age of water, when human populations started to grow, and not just started to grow, but started to outstrip the natural resources in the local areas, and communities grew and villages grew, and all of a sudden there wasn't really enough water, there wasn't really enough food, and we had to think as humans about resources in a different way. And the second age really began in the agricultural fields of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, where the first irrigation really began, the first intentional management of water resources. Ancient Mesopotamia, the river basins of the Tigris and the Euphrates River that come out of Turkey and into Syria and into modern day, what is modern day Iraq. That land area between the Tigris and the Euphrates was really when we saw the first flowering of civilizations. Babylonia, a lot of the ancient history comes from that time. And it expanded, the second age, when we saw the earliest really big cities start to develop, and the Romans and the Greeks learned how to move water with gravity a long distance, tens, 50, 100 kilometers, with some pretty remarkable engineering designs, the first real sophisticated engineering designs for cities to bring water from distant sources to supply concentrations of populations. This is a ancient Roman aqueduct. We see this in Granada at the Alhambra, where again there was Roman influence bringing water often very large distances, only by gravity, very sophisticated systems to towns and cities. The second age really began to flower in the 18th and 19th centuries during the Renaissance. We had a blossoming of art and science and culture and music, engineering, medicine, biology, a lot of the academic fields, a lot of the cultural experiences that we're all familiar with started in this period. And interestingly enough, a lot of that Renaissance was also related to water. Why water? Well, by the 1700s, the 1800s, it was pretty clear that some bad things were happening with water. We saw some pretty clear, unambiguous problems with water contaminations in those same big cities that were now being served by these innovative engineering designs. And this is the city of Cologne in Germany. In 1828, the poet Coleridge visited the city of Cologne, and he wrote a poem, part of which says, the river Rhine, which runs through the city of Cologne, the river Rhine, it is well known, doth wash the city of Cologne. But tell me, nymphs, what powers divine shall henceforth wash the river Rhine? It was like many of the big rivers that ran through the big cities in Europe, very heavily contaminated with human wastes, because that's what we did. We took water out of those rivers and we dumped our wastes right back into them. In the summer of 1858, Parliament shut down because the Thames was so horribly contaminated, and it was hot in the summer, the stench literally shut down the Parliament. The Parliament building's right on the river. It was so bad they had to close Parliament, and they went back to their cities and towns. Benjamin Disraeli called the Thames a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and intolerable horrors. Stygian, as in the river Styx, which runs through Hades, the river of hell. And the Illustrated London News, which I think was the biggest newspaper in London at the time, said, quote, We can colonize, we the British, we can colonize the remotest ends of the earth. We can conquer India, the British. We can pay interest on the most enormous debt ever contracted. We spread our name, our fame, our fructifying wealth across every part of the world, but we cannot clean the River Thames. So there was this realization that they were having water problems in the middle of the 1850s. And part of the realization of that came from the fact that one of the consequences of bad water was water-related diseases. And it wasn't just a dirty, smelly problem. It was a problem of human health. And in the middle of the 1800s, cholera was a very severe problem. It swept across Europe, it swept across Russia, it came across the Atlantic on ships, it went up the Mississippi River to St. Louis, it went out the Oregon Trail to Portland, to Oregon. Cholera was a severe problem. And again, it's the Renaissance. We're learning about medicine, we're learning about disease. It was right around the middle of the 1850s that the first epidemiology, really, was developed that figured out that cholera was a waterborne disease, not an airborne disease. They didn't really know until then, but the first sciences of epidemiology and the study of medicine and disease spread really developed that understanding. And that led to a whole set of efforts to clean up water. And that really was the full flowering of the Second Age. This was a time when we created the first machines to provide, the first machines, non-gravity fed, to provide water supply. We developed the first physical, chemical, and biological treatment of water. Is John still here? John Friedman? I was going to ask a question that only he could raise his hand to, just to embarrass him. And this is what GE does and many other companies, and this is what our water agencies now do. They provide water supply, and they collect and they treat our wastewater. And this is all developments from this Second Age of water. We learned how to build the first dams for water supply or for flood protection or for irrigation or ultimately for hydroelectricity production. We learned how to build aqueducts not tens or hundreds of kilometers long, but thousands of kilometers long, and pump water over mountains to provide water supply. We saw the first large-scale irrigation systems that today feed 7 billion people, mostly, worldwide. And we eliminated, in the richer countries of the world, cholera and dysentery and typhoid and those water-related diseases. Those were the advances. And everyone in this room grew up in the Second Age of water. We're all living in that same age and benefiting from those advances. And now we're literally finding water on other planets. We have machines rolling around or circling other bodies in our solar system, many of which are looking for and finding water. This is an image from Mars. The scientists are debating this, but there's some thought that these are liquid flows during certain periods of Mars's climate. Recent flows, like in the last few decades. But we know that there's water on the moon. We know there was water on Mars. We know there's water on Enceladus, one of the moons of Saturn. This is a photograph from one of the satellites that we sent up that's circling Saturn. These are water vapor geysers from the interior of Enceladus. And we take almost all of it for granted, those of us in the wealthier countries. But as we enter the 21st century, things are changing again. Water is again taking center stage as one of our most critical, precious, underappreciated, badly managed resources. Why? Because despite the advances of the Second Age, the technical and engineering advances, despite the money that we have available, the money we've spent already, and the money that really is still available to deal with these problems, we have unresolved water problems. Old ones, like the ones I've described, water supply, water contamination, but new ones as well. And I'm going to describe some of those. Although first, despite water on other planets, I'm from California. We just have come out of a 5-year drought. which provided a lot of fodder for water analysts and for cartoonists. So here are some of our challenges. We have water quality problems today, still. They continue to plague us. Human wastes, increasingly industrial wastes of different kinds. This was a photograph from 1952 of the Cuyahoga River catching fire in Ohio. The Cuyahoga River caught fire in 1969. That event was caught on national TV. And for those of us of a certain age, we remember that because that was one of the events, really one of the two events in 1969 that contributed enormously to the public awakening about environmental issues that ultimately led to the Clean Water Act in 72, and the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act in 72 and 74, and the Clean Air Act, some of the foundational environmental laws today that still guide us to some degree, and I'll come back to some of that. At the time, Time magazine described the Cuyahoga River as a river, quote, that oozes rather than flows, in which a person does not drown but decays. Sort of like that 1858 London Times story. And this led to enormous improvements in water quality. The Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and a lot of cleanup resulted. The Cuyahoga River is sort of a success story in many ways today. Lake Erie is much cleaner today than it was in the 60s and the 70s because of this awakening, this environmental awakening, and yet we still have serious problems. This is the James River in Virginia, caught fire because of an oil tanker spill in 2014. This is a toxic algal bloom in Lake Erie in 2014 that shut down the water supply system of Toledo, Ohio for several days. One of the sophisticated urban water systems that was not designed, it was designed to deal with the water contaminants that we are regularly faced with, but not toxic algae. And this is a problem of nutrients. I would argue it's a problem of climate change and temperature, and it's an ongoing new challenge. Oops, getting ahead of myself here. I could have a slide about Flint, Michigan. Let me just mention it. Those of you who are paying attention to national news know that despite the fact that the United States has a remarkably great municipal water system, we're not maintaining it. And we have problems like Flint, Michigan, where even today some of our cities are decaying in their water quality infrastructure. And that's an infrastructure problem, and it's an investment problem, and it's a management and a political problem, and I'll come back to some of that a little bit later as well. Second, food production requires water. 80% of the water that humans use comes out of, goes to agriculture. 80% of the water that humans consume on the planet goes to agriculture. And we're producing food for 7 billion people worldwide. It's a pretty remarkable thing, but food production is a critical challenge. There's little additional land that can be brought into production, and especially, I would argue, there's little additional water available for expanding food production for growing populations. We have massive groundwater overdraft. A very substantial amount of the world's food production today comes from unsustainable overdraft of groundwater. That can't continue, and we're trying to grow food for 7 billion and then 8 billion and then 9 billion, and I'm not sure where it's going to stop. But even today, much of food production is unsustainable from a water perspective. A lot of the technology we use for agriculture is old irrigation technology. It's inefficient and wasteful. And maybe more important, a lot of our laws and institutions around water are old and out of date and not updated for the modern world. Third, the ecological consequences of our water use are growing. If I had to pick one glaring flaw of the second age of water, it was the fact that we paid no attention to the ecological side of what we were doing. We didn't know about the ecological damage that we were causing by the strategies we put in place in the second age of water to satisfy what we needed from a water perspective, or we didn't care. It was sort of a combination of both. We didn't know and we didn't care, but it had enormous ecological consequences. A lot of the ecological problems that we see today are water-related. They're aquatic ecosystems, they're disappearing wetlands, they're collapsing fisheries. They're related to the way we collect and use water and the way we get rid of wastewater, and it's a problem. The Aral Sea in the former Soviet Union, the Central Asian republics, has been destroyed, pretty much destroyed, because of irrigation for cotton in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And the 24 species of fish that were endemic to the Aral Sea, as in found only in the Aral Sea, are extinct. They're gone because of our use of water. This is the Salton Sea in Southern California. It's drying up. It's a major part of the migratory bird route, the Pacific Flyway in California. It's a critical resource. You're going to be hearing more about the Salton Sea in the next 5 years, from health impacts to ecological collapse. The Nile Delta, the Yellow River in China, more and more rivers don't reach their deltas anymore. The Everglades, probably all of you can think of a river or a lake or a stream that's ecologically damaged because of human use of water. Fourth, water and politics makes a volatile combination. And we're going to talk a little bit about this today. The title is Cooperation and Conflict Over Water of this meeting. I'm going to talk about it a little bit right now, just briefly to introduce the topic. But competition for water is growing. Where water is scarce, it's growing. Where water is abundant, but populations are growing, conflict is increasing. There's a long history of conflict over water. Interestingly enough, going back to ancient Mesopotamia. One of the things we do at the Pacific Institute is we maintain something called the Water Conflict Chronology. It's a database, for those of you who like history, it's a database, just Google Water Conflict Chronology, of all of the water conflicts that we know about, violent, where there was violence, going back 4,500 or 5,000 years. Some of the first entries are from ancient Mesopotamia, a conflict between two city-states, Umma and Lagash, over an irrigation canal. And the most recent conflicts are just a few weeks ago in the database. We're updating it for 2016. This is just a screenshot of the chronology. Each one of these little things is an entry. You can click on it, get the date, you can get the type of conflict, you can select the actors, there's references for each one of these things. It's quite interesting for those of you interested in the topic. But this is a little analysis of the numbers of events in the database over time, really just in the last 60 or 70 years, I guess, 1930 to 2015. Again, we're about to put the 2016 numbers on. And it shows an increase over time. Now, part of this is better reporting. When there's a violent conflict over water, when somebody dies in a riot over water availability, or whether there's attack on a water system or the use of water as a weapon, social media gets it right away, and my phone buzzes. And so the further back in time you go, it's hard to know what's being recorded and not. But I also believe this is a real trend. I think because populations are growing, because of scarcity, because of economic conflict over water, because of tensions over agricultural production, I think we're seeing an increase in conflicts over water, and I think that trend is going to continue. Fifth, on top of these worries, we now have climate change. And again, I suspect I don't need to say this for this particular audience, but humans are changing the climate. I'm not saying humans are going to change the climate. Humans are changing the climate. That is unambiguous. I say it's undisputable, which is different than it's not disputed. There are still people who deny the reality of climate change, but they do so not on a scientific fact basis. They do that for reasons of their own, which I won't go into. And we have to address that. This is the greatest human disruption to the environment the planet has ever seen, and it's going to get substantially worse. And the climate cycle is the hydrologic cycle. The hydrologic cycle is the climate cycle. This is a water issue. It's a human migration issue. It's a human health issue. It's an everything issue because we're all embedded in the climate. We're all dependent on the climate. But it's a big water issue. We are going to see and are already seeing changes in precipitation patterns. We very clearly see rises in temperature, which increases demand for water, or loss of water from reservoirs or soils. More extreme events, both floods and droughts. Disappearing ice. The Arctic is collapsing now. And we've waited too long to act. We should have been addressing this issue 40 or 50 years ago. Some of the recent weather extremes we've seen, I would argue, are harbingers of climate change. This is what's evidence that climate's already changing, and it's an indication of what we're going to see coming. Think about this really as a question of risk. We buy insurance for things that we don't want to happen, but that might happen, that we want to prepare ourselves for, to protect ourselves from the unexpected car accident or the fire or earthquakes or floods. I won't get into the risk insurance business, the flood insurance business, that's a whole separate issue. But if we think about climate change as a risk, we ought to be doing things to protect ourselves from those risks. And that includes dealing with the unavoidable consequences of climate changes that are already coming, but reducing the risk that climate change is going to continue to get worse and worse and worse. And that's the emissions side of things. And that's partly what the Paris Agreement that some of the speakers this morning touched on. I'm not going to talk much more about that. Sixth, and perhaps most important, populations are growing. And we're already failing to meet basic human needs for water and sanitation. There are today 700, 800 million people without access to safe drinking water, and 2.5 billion, 2.4 billion people without access to adequate sanitation services. For them, the second age of water hasn't been a complete success. We, as a globe, have failed to meet basic human needs for water for everyone on the planet. And, one more climate change slide here. This is a quote from 1990, a book published in 1990, which was a long time ago now. Governments at all levels should reevaluate legal, technical, and economic procedures for managing water resources in the light of climate changes that are highly likely. This was a recommendation for water managers almost 30 years ago. Okay. Basic needs for water. We failed to meet basic human needs for water. And because of that, there is still cholera and typhoid and dysentery and the water-related diseases that we know how to prevent, and perhaps 2 million preventable deaths a year, mostly children under the age of 5, from these diseases, from this failure. And this is probably, as I said, in my opinion, the most basic failure of the 20th century. We have a long way to go to meet basic human needs for water for all. Now, so there are lots of problems out there, and I would argue that some of these problems can be addressed with the tools that we've applied in the 20th century and the second age of water. We know how to meet basic needs for water. We know how to clean up water. We understand risk assessment and risk management tools. We have economic tools that we've put in place. And there are things that we ought to do that we're doing in richer countries that we ought to be doing much more widely. No new technology really has to be introduced to meet a lot of these needs. No new institutions need to be developed. But there are some fundamental differences now in the 21st century. We have absolute scarcity over water in some regions. So in the old days, 20 years ago, water scarcity meant build another dam, drill another groundwater well, build another longer aqueduct, focus on water supply. But in a time when more and more regions are at the limits of their water supply, new supply is not the answer. We have absolute scarcity. What I've described with some of my colleagues as peak water is being reached in more and more regions. We might want more water out of the Nile. Egypt might want more water out of the Nile. China might want more water out of the Yellow River. We might want more water in the US out of the Colorado River, but there isn't any more. We use it all. And from an ecological perspective, one could argue we use too much of it already. Ecological destruction, if we're going to reverse that, we're going to have to think about returning water to natural ecosystems. Climate change is a new problem. None of our institutions, none of our infrastructure was designed with a changing climate in mind. It was designed for the climate that we thought we were going to have forever. Political conflict over water. Yes, there are tools of diplomacy that we ought to be applying to that problem. I'll come back to that in a moment too. But there are new forms of conflicts over water, and we need some new thinking about that as well. And we have some bad institutions, and we have unjust economic systems. We have inequities due to ideological and political and racial politics and policies. There is a human right to water. Water is an economic good, but it's also a human right. And this is one of those challenges for the 21st century that we're just beginning to deal with. We've thought about water as an economic good for a long time, but finally in 2010, the UN declared a human right to water, a legal human right to water out of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. And now we have to think about what that really means and how to implement it. This is one piece of the good news. And so let me sort of finish the last part of this with some good news. There's a lot of good news. I think, as I said at the beginning, we're in a transition. We're in a transition from the second age of water to what I think is the third age of water, an age of sustainable management and use of water resources. And let me talk about what I mean by that. There's a lot of interesting stories out there. We got some of that this morning on different pieces of the puzzle. What I'd like to do is integrate that. We live in a period of time when there are a lot of new ideas being explored and tested, where people are talking about innovation. We had a conversation this morning about innovation. The human right to water is an institutional and legal and moral and ethical innovation that we've just started to apply and figure out what it means and how to balance it against the more traditional economic value of water. California law has declared a human right to water. The South African Constitution says there's a human right to water. Interestingly enough, it also says there's an ecological right to water. And so that's the second piece of this new age, I would argue. That's the ecological right to water. We're learning how to restore natural ecosystems. This is a slide of something called the Elwha Dam in Washington State in the Olympic Peninsula. It's an old dam. It was built to provide a little bit of power, to provide water for the logging industry on the Elwha River. It really sort of mucked up, with an M, a very nice, free-flowing river. Is that two? Okay. So that's what it looked like. And then we removed it. And in the US, we've removed 500 or 600 dams. Small dams mostly. The Elwha is not so small. And within a few years, really, it's only been a couple of years, this is what the river looks like. But more importantly, it's restoring salmon runs miles upstream already of where that dam was. The salmon have returned and are spawning upstream. It's one of the ecological restoration success stories. And there's more and more understanding of the importance of healthy water, healthy rivers for healthy ecosystems. Third, we have to move from a focus on supply to demand. That is, Instead of the idea of always trying to find more and more water, we need to think about how we're using water. And that's the issue of water conservation and efficiency. So think about it this way. We don't want to use water, except for really fundamental basic needs. We want clean clothes, and we want a nice garden, and we want to grow food, and we want to make things that sometimes require water. But the idea of demand, thinking about demand means let's figure out what we want to do, and let's figure out how to do it with less water than we're spending to do it today, through improvements in technology, conservation, and efficiency. Front-loading washing machines that use 1/3 the water and 1/3 the energy and much less detergent and do a better job than the old top-loading washing machines. It's providing a service. That's the service we want, clean clothes, or meters that tell us how we're using water and give us information about the possibility that we have a leak in our home, or a beautiful drought-resistant garden rather than a water-consuming lawn. There's a lot that we can do in the demand side of the equation. And in 5 years of drought in California, believe me, there's been a big debate about outdoor landscaping and what are we really spending our precious water on, and how can we do what we want with less water. Another side of this, fourth, is rethinking supply. There are parts of the world where we need new, traditional, classic second age of water supply ideas, dams, irrigation systems. But there are also new sources of supply, and I'm just going to very briefly, this is the agricultural piece of this. We can grow a lot more food with a lot less water, and that reduces the pressure on a lot of water systems around the world. We talked this morning a little bit about wastewater treatment and reuse. We might not be building many more dams in the United States, but we have a tremendous volume of water that's wastewater that in the past we treated to some standard because of the Clean Water Act, and then we threw it away. And you heard John Friedman talk about the work that GE is doing. There are a lot of people thinking about wastewater treatment and reuse as a new source of supply, and Singapore has led in this area as well. Desalination is a potential new source of supply. We know how to take salt out of water. It's really expensive. That's, I think, unavoidable. It's always going to be expensive, but it's cheaper now than it used to be. Improvements in membranes, costs are coming down. It's more expensive at the moment than conservation and efficiency. It's more expensive than wastewater treatment and reuse, which is partly why Israel recycles all of its water first, and their per capita water use is way down, and now they're building desalination plants because they did the cheaper things first. But it's a new source of supply. It's a new way of thinking about the supply challenge. Finally, we have to fix our water institutions and laws. Nelson Mandela said, interestingly enough, referring to water, "It is one thing to find fault with an existing institution. It is another thing altogether, a more difficult thing, to replace it with an approach that is better." We're burdened in some ways with institutions designed for the second age of water, not for the third age of water. And part of our challenge is redesigning our institutions. We have water utilities over here and energy utilities over here, but there are incredible connections between energy and water. And if we thought about water and energy together, something the academics are talking about as the water-energy nexus, we might do things differently. We would do things differently. We have water utilities that only think about supply because there's no incentive for them to conserve water because their revenues go down. That's an institutional challenge. There's a lot that we could do to make our water institutions better. And it's part education, how our universities teach about water, which is part of the conversation here at PACE, how to design institutional organizations that are truly interdisciplinary to deal with the complex engineering and political and legal and economic pieces of this puzzle, and so on. Part of its management, part of its individuals, what we do as individuals, our behavior, our diet. Meat diets are more intensive than non-meat diets. It's partly political. How do we apply the tools of diplomacy to some of these challenges? So let me close with one final piece of the puzzle. This is a graph that shows from 1900 to 2010, the green line is the gross domestic product of the United States. That curve economists love to see growing exponentially. And we can talk someday about how appropriate that is. But I didn't plot population here, but the population of the United States follows that same exponential growth curve. The blue line is total water withdrawals in the United States. Withdrawals for everything: agriculture, power plant cooling, washing your clothes, watering your lawns, everything. And it also shows, for the first 3/4 of the 20th century, exponential growth, along with the GNP and population. And this is what I have an undergraduate engineering degree. I'm not an engineer, but this is what all water planners are taught to assume, that these two curves will grow together. Economy grows, population grows, demand for water is going to grow. Therefore, you have to find more water. But something weird happened in the late 70s, early 80s. Those two curves split apart. And today, total water use in the United States is less than it was almost 40 years ago, probably 40 years ago. And on a per capita basis, much less than it was 40 years ago. If the two curves had continued together, we would have had to find this much more water. Where? Certainly not in the western US. We already use 100% of the Colorado River, for example. We already overdraft groundwater. This is what I mean by we're in a new world. We're in a world of peak constraints. But we're also in a world of transition. And it's sometimes hard when you're in the middle of a transition to see that transition. So you have to look back sometimes in history to see, oh, that was a turning point. But I think we're in the middle of a transition to a sustainable future. This is really good news. This permits us to take down the Elwha dams. This permits us to grow more food with less water, to replace our old inefficient washing machines and dishwashers, to change the structure of our economy, to move to more sustainable water management and use. This is an indication of the fact that I think we're moving toward in some ways, the third age of water. I could talk about why this happened. Maybe we could talk about that later. It leads into the panel discussion about national water policy, about whether we ought to have a national water policy. We don't. About whether there ought to be better integration among the 20+ federal agencies that have some responsibility for water. NOAA does weather forecasting. USGS monitors groundwater and water quality. Department of Agriculture deals with food production. The State Department does diplomacy around water to the extent they do diplomacy at all these days. There are 20 federal agencies. There is no Department of Water. Maybe there ought to be a conversation about how to do that better. The last time the US had a National Water Commission to think about this at the federal level was 1970. Well back in the second age, the classical second age of water. What about investment? We're supposed to be having a conversation about infrastructure, bipartisan. Part of that should be a water conversation. Climate change, how do we integrate that into our policies? Diplomacy, law. There are implications of the third age of water for US water policy, and it's time to have that conversation. So the third age of water is coming. The transition is happening. I think it means that we all need to shift to a new way of thinking about water, and I hope we can find ways to continue to encourage that thinking. Thank you very much.